The House voted today to approve another short-term spending bill, despite a revolt by more than 50 fiscal conservatives. If approved in the Senate, the bill would avert a federal government shutdown, at least for 3 more weeks. So, just when will the Tea Party demands for long-term, deep spending cuts finally be heard in Washington? Joining the Kudlow call to action tonight, 2 Tea Party favorites, freshman Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and Mike Lee of Utah. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Before we get to the spending agenda, Senator Lee, let me just ask you, Japan, obviously everyone's talking about Japan. It is a great friend of the United States. It is a great ally of the United States. It is a counterweight to China, which is not such a great friend to the United States. Do you have a thought on the Japanese situation?
Yeah, it's very sad. My heart goes out to them, and I think the thoughts and prayers of millions of Americans go out to them. But I think we can't look at that situation and be as fearful as we can of many other countries in the world that are going through turmoil. In Japan, you've got stable civil society organizations that will step in. You've got a stable government, and you've got democracy in action, and I think we've got every confidence that they're going to be able to rebuild.
You know, that's a great point. Senator Paul, let me ask you, it's a free country, number one, unlike, let's say, China, which is not a free country, and a lot of Middle Eastern countries. Number two, they do have stable institutions. Will they recover? Do they need our help, or will they recover on their own?
I think they'll recover. I think one of the amazing things about the Japanese people is you saw when they were short of water, queuing up in a long, winding line, everyone standing very calmly and very peacefully for hours waiting for water. I think it's an amazing culture and has the great ability, and I think they will rebound. I'll tell you what I do worry a little bit about, though, is, you know, their debt. Their debt problem as a percentage of their GDP is nearly 200%, approaching 200%, and then they're going to have this big hit of all the spending they're going to need. Many people who look at debt crisis problems are saying, you know what, Japan's headed towards a debt crisis. My worry is that all the spending on this crisis, which they have no control over, may well speed up the time of a crisis.
On top of a bunch of spending over the last 20 years, it really hasn't worked, like stimulus packages gone awry. Senator Lee, just quickly before we get to our spending, the nuclear reactor business in Japan, the difficulties, does that spell the end of nuclear power in the United States, or will you stay with it?
I certainly hope not, and I intend to stay behind nuclear power as a clean, safe form of electric power generation. Look, we can learn from this, we can improve upon it, and I think they will avert disaster over there, and I think we can learn from what's happening there to make our reactors safer.
Senator Rand, will you vote for the continuing resolution coming over from the House to the Senate to avert a shutdown?
Well, I don't think we should shut down government, but I don't like either the Republican or the Democrat proposal for one main reason. Both of them perpetuate an enormous deficit. The annual deficit for this year will be $1.65 trillion under the Democrats. Under the Republicans, it'll still be $1.55 trillion. I didn't come to Washington to vote for deficits. I came to Washington to try to balance the budget, cut federal spending, and people at home don't understand what's going on. Up here, they think, oh, we could never cut $500 billion. At home, when I tell them I want to cut $500 billion, they say, that's only a third of the problem. We want you to cut more.
You believe we could cut $500 billion?
Absolutely.
Across the board?
We have a bill that'll do it.
A bill, you co-sponsoring? Are you a co-sponsor with Senator Rand's bill?
We're still reviewing it. I support it in principle, and I think we need to explore
Senator Paul's bill.
Much more aggressive forms of deficit cutting. I mean, look, there are many in this town who want us to think that we face a dichotomy, a binary choice between, on the one hand, a government shutdown, and on the other hand, an annual deficit exceeding $1.5 trillion. That's ridiculous. We have other options on the table.
What's the better path? Well, that is the binary option. That is where the debate is. What's the better path?
But it shouldn't be.
No, I refuse to buy into the idea that this is a binary choice, and it isn't. There is some place in between those two extremes where the American people would be best served.
Senator McConnell looked kindly, I interviewed him yesterday, on your spending limitation idea. Has that got legs? You want to have, what, 18, 20% of GDP for spending? And if they don't get there, sequestration, budget cuts, penalties, oh my gosh.
Yes, and 18%. And that's roughly what we take in every year. Over the last 40 or 50 years, the average revenue equals about 18% of gross domestic product in the United States. That's what we ought to be spending, and we ought not be spending more than that.
You're nodding your head. Do you agree with that?
Well, what I would say is it isn't an either-or situation. You know, it's not a Hobson's choice. It's a false choice. There's something in between. It's not either we spend what they want or we shut it down. What about we spend what we have? We bring in about $200 billion a month. Let's spend what we have. I tell people I'm not against government. I'm all for spending 2.2 trillion. That's what we bring in.
Yeah, that's about right. About 3.6 trillion in spending, but we only bring in 2.2 trillion. Are you ready to cut entitlements? Are you ready to reform entitlements?
I think the better word is reform. Yes, Mike and I and Senator Graham are going to be introducing in the next week or two Social Security reform, which will fix it in perpetuity.
How will you do that, Senator Lee? You're co-sponsoring with Senator Paul.
Well, how we will reform entitlements will depend to a significant degree on how far the president's willing to lead out on this. We desperately need presidential leadership. So far, what we've had from the president is radio silence. We need him to weigh in. Right now, we're pushing forward with binding Congress, tying Congress's hands and forcing it to balance its budget, which will in turn bring about the necessary entitlement reform and other aspects of spending reform.
Is there a switch and bait game going on? I mean, politically, it's very important. The White House, sometimes the president says he wants to reform entitlements. You guys come up with some sensible proposals to reform entitlements, and you get whack-a-mole in the next election. I call that bait and switch. What do you call it?
Well, I just call it an abdication of leadership. I don't think he wants to lead. I don't think he is willing to lead. And the thing is I think we can have leaders within Congress who boldly say, this is how we fix Social Security, this is how we fix Medicare, and this is how we fix the budget. The numbers are out there. It's very doable. Someone just needs to be brave enough to do it.
All right, gentlemen, with much regret because of the Japanese news, I've got to get moving. I appreciate your coming on, Senator Rand Paul, Senator Mike Lee. Thanks to both of these gentlemen.